This is the story of how nuclear weapons changed the US presidency. And what it did, as I began to understand this, is the arrival of nuclear weapons began to fundamentally reshape Washington in two big ways, because it compressed time and space in a way that we had never had to deal with before. That, you know, the U.S. presidency up until the end of the end of World War II was not a particularly fast institution. As late as 1935, when FDR was on his way back from the dedication of the Hoover Dam, his motorcade got lost in the canyons outside Las Vegas, and the president just disappeared for the afternoon. And no one knew when he was going to pop up, where he might next appear, or how long he was going to be out of touch. And as late as January 1945, when Harry Truman took over as vice president, the vice president didn't actually have any Secret Service protection. The vice president just sort of wandered around Washington unmolested during the day. And, you know, as long as like you could get a hold of him in the course of an afternoon or by the next morning, like you could actually, that was all you needed for the vice president. Well, nuclear weapons began to compress the decision-making time such that the president needed to be in constant communication, that the vice president needed to be locatable, and sort of on down through the US government, which I'll come back to in a second. And then the second is we began to struggle for the first time with the question of what happens if an entire city is wiped out in an instant. Obviously, this was a new threat of the nuclear age, of the atomic age. And as he was saying during the introduction, in thinking about and talking about those early years, sort of part of what's strange to consider now when we look back on this is that for, that first decade or so of the atomic age, there was actually very much the idea that a nuclear war could be a survivable phenomenon, that it would be awful for sure, but you were talking about bombers moving slowly through from Soviet airspace, so you would have 8, 10, 12 hours worth of warning, plenty of time to evacuate senior officials, even to evacuate large chunks of cities. And that, particularly in those early years, you weren't talking about, as he said, super duper bombs. You weren't talking about all that many bombs. So there was the idea that you might have, the loss of a couple dozen cities. You might have, Washington get hit by one atomic bomb. Which at that point wouldn't, necessarily even have wiped out the entire city. And so you had sort of this weird moment where the government was like, oh, well, like we can actually plan and organize around how to respond to a nuclear attack. And then you have the shift from bombers to missiles. You go from 8, 10, 12 hours worth of warning to just 15 to 30 minutes. Washington, if there was a submarine off the East Coast, you might be talking about as few as 8 to 11 minutes worth of warning. And then actually even one of the weirder things I discovered in this was that the Soviet embassy on 16th Street at that point, during the Eisenhower and Kennedy years, U.S. actually believed that the Soviets had an atomic bomb in the attic on the 3rd floor there, and so you might not get any warning at all. Now, of course, the Soviet embassy, the Russian embassy, is radioactive for a slightly different reason in Washington. But at that point, you have not just the technology and the warning speed change, but you also have the shift from nuclear bombs to thermonuclear bombs, from atomic bombs to hydrogen bombs. And then just the sheer scale of these arsenals also begins to expand dramatically. And so nuclear war quickly became something that was much less manageable and much less something that you could actually plan for.